So one of the reasons why I kind of took an interest in DEI work is because of how it intersects with the legal industry. It kind of started as a risk management type or risk mitigation type of thing where companies were essentially like, how do we hire the people we're supposed to hire to make sure we not getting sued for being discriminatory? And so
We
there's
don't want to
always been
stop and get sued for it.
that part. And so sort of looking at how DEI traces its roots to, JFK's affirmative action order and government contractors trying to keep that good old government money running in has always been interesting to me. And so I kind of just want to start off by asking you, Diontha, to give us some of that history so we have a context to place all of this in, because I'm sure nobody's going to be surprised to know that this didn't start out as Zoom workshops and We Are the World Kumbaya conferences.
No, absolutely not. I think you hit the nail on the head, Amber, when you talked about, the affirmative action plans, which ironically I have responsibility for as well. So, affirmative action plans were really started as an opportunity for companies to be able to respond to government contracts, remain eligible for those. And so, what affirmative action plans do is look at, what is the available marketplace look like? Is there analysis to see, are there opportunities to have goals in hiring? Are they having disparate impact for turnover and for promotions? That work eventually, moved more to DEI, where you're looking less at a quota, a number, and looking more at what we like to say, tying DEI to the business. What is the bottom line? What is the impact to the market going to be, and how are we going to make companies more profitable by hiring and promoting more diverse individuals within our companies? I think over time, diversity has definitely grown from being not just about race and gender, where it started with affirmative action. We talk about diversity being more about multiple dimensions, including, you know, neurodiversity now, the LGBTQ community, those individuals with disabilities and veterans. And so really it has really grown a lot. Which is a good thing, but I think there are some complications that come with that as well. I like to call it a scarcity of resources because, for instance, a lot of companies, DEI is just a very small team, maybe one person or two people, very limited funding, and you have a lot of different individuals and groups who are vying for that funding. And so, it does sometimes cause a little bit of friction because, who do you help when? And that makes it very difficult sometimes.
Deonta, my favorite part is when you'll have somebody at the workshop and they're like, well, what about diversity of thought? And then I just want to punch them in the face. Like, do y'all see that at the workshops? Y'all, the people who raise their hand and talk about that,
Oh yeah.
the explicit get it because I'm just not gonna be able to help myself.
It's always that one oppressed white man, they got
Yes.
they oppression testimony. Yes, yes.
Yeah, or geographic location is another one, and as well as diversity of thought. And I agree, I'm like, man, it really, I think sometimes you move to that area of comfortability where people are comfortable talking about. And that's why I say sometimes it's a good thing and it's a bad thing. It does allow us to include more people, but sometimes it really detracts from what I think the programs started for and looking at, creating racial equity in hiring and different programs. And so that sometimes can be very frustrating, not just for individuals and companies, but, really, quite frankly, for me as well.
Yeah.
So you getting pissed off too, Deonta. Okay, it's good to know. It's good to know. So help us to understand, give some definitions for these things. Because a lot of people, like some of the brokers might be like, what is DEI? I've heard of it, but I don't really know what it is. And there's been this term called Jedi, where they're trying to throw a little justice in with the DEI. So, Deonta, help define for us diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Yeah, definitely. So diversity is really looking at, who are you hiring, who's included. So, one of the analogies I often hear used is you think about a coloring box. We got this coloring box. You want to make sure you don't just get the 8 pack. We're getting the larger pack with all the different colors. And then inclusion is looking at, okay, you're not just using one color. You want to include a lot of the different colors and make sure that you're including, everyone in that box, as many people as possible. And then equity, when you think about equity, it's like we don't want to just color with one color or two colors, in one section. We want to blend everything together. We want to make sure that everyone has access, and fair access and opportunity, to be able to grow and develop, and access to resources.
So what's interesting is, everybody talks a lot about the D in the DE and I. And then it kind of becomes like diversity, equity, and inclusion, like, we don't really we don't really want to talk about
They
sharing
love talking
space
about the
on.
D, don't they?
Yeah.
Y'all just
Ba-da-ba-ba.
sorry,
But
Amber.
listen, I love a good D joke. Hey, but no, it's interesting to hear you talk about it like that because, does it really matter if you have the 42 pack crayon box if you're only using the eight, or right, if the eight are only ones that are represented in the artwork? And so, how do you, as a DEI professional, work to create that emphasis on the equity and inclusion part too, when people are always just like, we've done our job, we got a 42 pack crayon, check, move on, we finished? How do you keep bringing people back to, there's also the equity and the inclusion and the J for the Jedi people as well?
Yeah, the good justice, and equity and justice are newer, parts of DEI. And so that's something that I think a lot of companies are just now starting to bring in, define for their employees and really focus on. For me, that's really a part of the strategy, and looking at, not just your metrics, but looking at what are your policies and procedures, really looking at the qualitative and the quantitative data, listening to employees and what they're saying. I always say that, DEI is, my job. I do the strategy, but I'm not the sole one responsible for this work. It's everybody's work, including leaders. Leadership really has to be bought in, because they're the ones that are responsible for making, a big difference in this work. A lot of what, we've really been focused on, and I think a lot of companies have been focused on, we talked about the corny trainings, is I think what's been good the last couple of years, since the murder of George Floyd, is this uncomfortableness, in these conversations, and having these conversations about racism, and hearing from people of, like Black and brown people who have been the target of racism, because that is what's so important when you talk about equity, and really having those conversations that challenge what have been the norms in corporate America. A good example that I think of is, interrogating job descriptions and thinking, is a degree really required for this role, or is experience enough? Because when we have that conversation and we say, okay, experience is enough, that really opens up job opportunities and growth opportunities for individuals that maybe have not had access to higher education.
Yeah,
So, Deonta, you and I talk about DEI a lot, and we talk about whether it's the trainings or the seminars or how corporations are approaching it. And we also have had conversations around who is delivering the message. So you talked about like maybe having more people of color, more Black people actually presenting these messages. But we know that there have also been some other folks who have been profiting off of this DEI space, right? So, um, according to estimates, y'all's friend and author of White Fragility, Robin DiAngelo, right? So apparently she gets 20 or 30,000, and I think for each
I
of her
agree.
speaking
Yeah.
engagements. I feel like this is a lowball estimate for Miss D'Angelo. I think she's doing better than that. Her book sold like 800,000 copies. And then fortunately or unfortunately, after the death of George Floyd, all of these books were flying off the shelves, right? So this number is just going up. And so when we think about people like her, how do you feel about whether it's white folks or just other folks who really aren't disenfranchised becoming the faces and leading the efforts? Or do you kind of feel like, well, white people, that really is kind of y'all's business and y'all need to get your people together, gather them up, and teach them how it needs to go? So, what's your take on it?
You know, it's a really interesting question, because I do think that there's kind of a paradox there. You know, part of it is we heard from Black people saying, I don't want to be responsible for educating you. This is not my work to do, it's your work to do. And I do feel like there's a big component to that. There's got to be some individual curiosity and some individual work that you as a person have to do to really work at being anti-racist, and in recognizing bias and overcoming that. But I do think that there is an opportunity and there is a space for white thought leaders in DEI. We talked about a little bit before, DEI has moved beyond just race. And so there are intersections. But beyond that, it's the white experience with racism as well. My problem is I think that they should not be solely the people that are called on. And if I see a panel where it's, a conversation about race and it's all white people on the panel, I don't even listen, engage in it, because you've not been a target of racism. You don't have the experiences that a Black or brown person has. And where's the equity? Where's the person that's acting as an ally on that panel to say someone that has this lived experience should be here having this conversation?
So are you going out there
Absolutely.
telling people this? See, that's, of course, the problem with corporate America, right? I think we have so many of the answers, but because people like to eat, right? Like we need paychecks, and especially Black people need paychecks. It's hard to push back on the system that's feeding you. So how do you sort of walk that tightrope of being able to say, no, you said you signed up for this. You hired me. I'm a director of DEI, but then what are the tangible things, and how do you push back against what I'm going to assume is not always the momentum in your favor?
Yeah, sometimes it's frustrating. I mean, I call you sometimes, but I think you pick and you choose your battles. And I think that this is not just for me, but any Black leaders. I've had Black leaders throughout my career that came up to me because I started in HR. Oh, there's somebody in Black in HR now. We need to do something for diversity and inclusion. And that happened to me when I was an HR assistant, from a vice president of the company. I'm like, but you hire people every day. So there's got to be some accountability for leaders, not just white leaders, but Black and brown leaders as well, to say, you know what, I'm hiring people. I want to make sure that we're hiring from this historically Black college, from this Hispanic serving institution. I want to make sure that we're including these individuals. And so those are the ways that we all can come together and we can all make a difference. As far as these panels and different things, because I'm responsible for bringing in guest speakers and even for looking at DEI consultants. And I make it my business to say, I go to their page to see the about us, their leadership team. Are the people that are talking to me on the phone Black and brown, but all your leadership is white? Because then I'm going to ask you about that. I'm going to ask you about your DEI efforts, because this isn't just about, what you can help me to do. I want to know what work you're doing, because just because you're a consultant and you do this work doesn't mean that you are doing it well within your own organization.
Yeah. And just sort of as an extension of that, like the idea that we are creating a commitment and walking out that commitment, do you find that it's challenging? Because like I know I do diversity work within my company, and one of the things that frustrates me is I feel like we talk a lot about the fruit but not the root. And to me, there just seems like there is a direct conflict between true diversity, equity, and inclusion and racial capitalism. And I feel like there is a wheel spinning that happens because it's like, unless you're willing to dig down into them roots and talk about how you make the money you make, how you spend the money you spend, the historical way that this company has come to be on the backs of Black, Brown, Indigenous communities, the ways that this product has been used to marginalize and otherize LGBTQ people, like, to me, there is a deep frustration I have that there is a very superficial way we engage this. And so, how do we really encourage companies to go deep and see that this is like a comprehensive part of a larger thing, not just sort of like you said, the two Black people who sit in the room on the HR suite who are supposed to put together the Black History program and the Veterans Day programs and the Pride Month stuff. Like, it can't just be that, and that is a frustration I have. And I don't know what to do with it.
Yeah, I don't either, quite frankly, because those are the types of conversations that are difficult to have. You have to have, this new term, psychological safety, to be able to have that conversation with people on your team and your leadership team. We can't get past having conversations about bias and a video about 1,000 paper cuts without people saying, I don't know what I can say now, and them having that uncomfortability to even get to that deeper level of the root cause issues. And then I think, especially right now with the tone of the country and, all the about CRT, the pushback on CRT, and is Black History Month, talking about Black History Month or MLK Day, is that CRT? What impact is that going to have on our ability to really get to some of these root cause issues and really make an impact?
I feel
Yeah.
like we can't really ever do that because companies are not incentivized to really solve this problem. I just feel like we're not. I think it's cute now to sort of admire the problem. Oh, this is a really nice one to solve. But I don't think there's any real incentive for companies to do that. I mean, everybody's still gonna make their money, whether whoever the worker bees are for them. And I just feel like we can't ever get there. But y'all, if I might, can I share my favorite mess of a DEI story? I have
Please.
one if I could share it.
Go ahead.
Especially because I feel like it's one of these topics that's come up in Black History Month. So the other thing about Diontha that I didn't mention is Diontha likes sports a lot, right? So she's a sports girl. I am not. But back when I was working, so this was a couple years ago actually. So I was working at this company and they were doing all of these DEI initiatives, and they like to bring out stars and have them come talk to y'all. So they bring out Brian Flores. And so I don't know who Brian Flores is. So I'm texting Deonta. I'm like, Deonta, there's this guy who's this head coach in the NFL. His name is Brian Flores. Have you ever heard of him? And she's like, yes. And so, we're texting back and forth. So I'm like, he's speaking at the panel. Or it's not even a panel, it's a conversation just with him. So this man gets talking, and then the moderator, who is a Black woman, she asked him about what did he think about sort of George Floyd's death, and how all of that went down, especially with the team members and the folks on his team. And he said, well, after all that, my first thought was for the white players because I didn't want them to feel like cast aside, right? And so I'm pissed. I'm like, Deonta, can you believe that this man just said that after George Floyd died, most of us saw the video, and your first thought is for the white players? Okay. So then she asked him about just like, Black History Month and that kind of thing. And he said, well, I just learned about Juneteenth a few weeks ago. So this was in 2020, right? So, and I'm saying, I get it. I'm from Texas. I'm from Houston. So maybe that's why I know Juneteenth more than maybe somebody else. Okay. And then she asked the man about like what conversations he might have been having with his children around this topic. And he was like, well, we live in Fort Lauderdale. We don't live in Miami. Really, a lot of this stuff we don't have to deal with. Okay, exactly. But my
Ooh.
point related to DEI and the current topic is these are the kinds of people that get brought out to bring a quote unquote Black person whole organization of thousands of employees, right? And then people get to thinking, well, what problem is there with race, right? Because Brian Flores, who is now suing the NFL, who when I heard him speak, he told us he didn't have a problem with race, right? When the NFL was paying him. But now all of a sudden in this Black History Month, we're all embracing him like, yes, Brian Flores is suing the NFL. And I'm like, when it's convenient for him, because when I heard him, he didn't have none of that to say. But I just feel like that is just symbolic of all of the conversations, not all of, many of the conversations that I have heard over my tenure in corporate America. And so, how do we work against these messages? Because then, how do I get to those 20,000 employees that he had a platform to say all this to? Right? Like, how do we fight the bad actors for us with these terrible messages about what it's like for whatever your particular area is? So whether it's LGBTQ or whether it's being Black or whether it's an intersection of all of those things.
Yeah, I think I always side eye, when companies bring in speakers like, Emmanuel Acho, because
Oh,
whose
oh,
feelings are you centering? Because you're not
oh.
centering mine. And that comfortability, who are you making comfortable? I think we talked about psychological safety before, and it's not just psychological, honestly. Look at Brian Flores. The conversation now is, will he ever get a coaching job in the NFL again? And is he, falling on the sword for everyone, for all Black coaches in the NFL? And I think that's a question that a lot of Black people, professionals, have in the back of their minds when you're having these honest conversations and you're sharing your feelings and pouring your heart out to your CEO, CHR, and leadership about what your experience has been and what really has been what you feel is your experience in corporate America. So that can be difficult when you're talking about, like Amber said, she just bought a house. Am I going to pay my mortgage or am I going to tell the truth? And so it shouldn't be. I mean, even when I was being introduced, I was like, ooh, did I say what company I work for? Maybe I shouldn't have done that. And how honest am I going to be in this conversation? And those are the
Yeah,
questions you have to ask yourself. And that's, part of the problem.
yeah,
Who are we centering and who are we protecting? And even going back to what I was saying, we talk about pushing back and looking at job descriptions and saying, do we really need a degree? I think the reason a lot of those conversations and even, people being silenced at work, the reason those things have happened is because it protects those that have been in power. And that's the way that it's meant to be for some time and will continue to be if that way continues.
and also I think it's interesting because one of the things that we don't talk about enough, I think, in this space, to the point that Erica's making about people like Brian Flores, is that there is a commodification of DEI work that's happening where the primary emphasis is not on bringing somebody in who is going to stretch us and help us to interrogate how we think about these issues and how we, look at the world through the eyes of somebody who occupies a different space than us. um we're trying to bring in people who are going to be impressive, who are going to grab headlines, and there is a business behind DEI now that makes it very sterile. Because then you look at people, and gosh, I'm really hesitant to go here for a lot of reasons, but you look at people like Emmanuel Acho and you think like, how how do you become the person that becomes the go-to person? Like, what makes you able to stand in these spaces and offer a perspective that's valuable? And I don't think those are questions we ask a lot, because this is a business decision at the end of the day. And I think that's one of the problems that um, really irks me the most, is that this work has become a part of the capitalist machine. This is about driving dollars. This is people's living now. This is not about truth. This is not about creating a pathway to truth. This is, this is dollar bills, and that is crazy to me that we have literally industrialized DEI work now.
Well, America ain't gonna do nothing else if it ain't gonna turn it into a business. Now let me tell you
That's
that.
true. That's
Okay.
true. That's
And
true.
and that's what I sort of meant from before. It's like I don't envy your work, Deonta, because I just feel like, honestly, you might get a sliver of truth in there, right? But to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth, I just don't think in this line of work, unless you are such a big personality and then finally you've sort of broken past the shackles, right? And maybe you're able to say a few more things than somebody else can say. You have a little bit more liberty. But I think that's part of it, right? So it's kind of like, okay, I'm gonna let you say just enough, but come on back and that's the part that makes the work, to at least from an outside observer, it makes it a bit sad, because it's just like, how do you ever really get there?
I
Yeah.
mean, if nothing else, you have in your back pocket are metrics and data. I mean, we look at companies some of these tech companies have been publishing and being transparent with their data for some time, and showing that they've had a DEI plan in place. But, not much has changed in the area of representation, especially, in leadership, but with some of those tech companies, not at all. And so when you go into these conversations and you're talking about why we need to maybe look at a policy on, you know, who we're promoting, or who's being hired, and you hear, well, everyone is responsible for their own career. You're responsible for your own development. Yeah, that sounds great. That's been, the mantra in corporate America for years, but how has that worked out? When we're
Right.
talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and if we're saying that we're making a commitment to, improve our numbers and to see that there are more people in higher positions, that hasn't worked very well. So we got to try something different, because that's just not going to cut it.
And to that point, one of the things that a sociologist, Dr. Kim Tran, talks about, and you mentioned this earlier when you first started talking about how particularly Black people who are placed in these DEI positions are placed in sort of these glass cliff positions where it's basically a setup. So it's a very metric driven, data driven evaluation, and you are given this impossible task to go in and DEI a whole company with a lack of funding, a lack of staff, a lack of
Participation.
support, a lack of participation, and a lack of resources. And then when the data comes back and it looks the same, it's like, well, the Black person failed. They didn't DEI us enough. So now you got to go. And it just seems like a self fulfilling prophecy, of why you need the work in the first place, of putting Black bodies, brown bodies, marginalized bodies in the impossible situation of doing work that your funding suggests you really don't care if it get done or not. But then you hold them to these impossible standards by looking at all of these metrics and data that doesn't show what you wanted to show, because you want a person to do like a Herculean task with a Happy Meal budget.
Right. You feel like you're putting the plane together as you're flying it. And it can be difficult, very difficult.
Well, Deonta, I don't want it to all be doom and gloom. So, can you point us to some bright spots, some things that you've done personally, or some things that you've seen work in the space?
Yeah, I think first of all, what I would say is, I think there's been some really inspiring and visionary work that's being done in DEI, since the murder of George Floyd. I think I've seen some companies large and small, that are really, putting together some programs and taking some steps to try things, that are going to help to bring people and, from customer service jobs, for instance, into like their IT department. And different things like that. So I think that that is really, really, it's good to see. And I hope it continues. I think one thing that has been missing, and I think one of you touched on it earlier, is that, you know, point of accountability. What accountability is there going to be for companies to be able to make progress, measurable progress on these commitments that they've made beyond the performative statements that they've done? And, let's cross our arms and say we are supporting diversity and put it on our social media page. That's going to be really, really key. To this point, I think I've seen accountability and I've seen companies continuing to invest in DEI longer than I thought, honestly, that they would when this whole DEI rush came in 2020. So I think those for me are some positive signs.
And I know one of the things that we were learning when we did research for this episode is that the money has increased. So one of the things that I learned from an article is that in 2017, there was about $8 billion in diversity spend. And then by the time that the measure was taken again, 2 months after George Floyd died, that had quadrupled to almost 32 billion with a B, excuse me, dollars. And so the question I have is, how do we direct that money in a way that reflects the statements that are coming out, where it's not just, we gave, money to the Black people we seen on CNN, or, we just, how do we make sure that that money is not just getting lost in the capitalist black hole of America, and that it is really going to do the work that these companies say they're committed to doing, and not to hiring Brian Flores.
I think a lot of the money went to Black Lives Matter. If uh,
Woo!
if you want to talk about it, and I just want to know where it
Woo!
is. Where
Woo!
is it?
Woo!
And that does not help at all. But I think one of the things that I think a lot of companies are doing is they're working through their ERGs, which can kind of be
What's the
problematic in of itself.
ERGs are, Deonta?
Employee resource groups or business resource groups or inclusion networks. It's groups of employees that are working in conjunction with DEI or helping to advance DEI initiatives within the company.
So give us an
I think
example, like the Black employee group or the.
the Black employee group or each ERG would have a budget for nonprofits and donations, and they make the decision on those organizations that they're donating to. Now, they might have some criteria or guidelines. For instance, we want to make sure that we are giving to a 501c3 in the US, globally, that is related to these different, like maybe career. We want to help those individuals and underserved communities to with different new pathways into if we're a oral healthcare company in the dental field. So that's an example. Giving money to the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, where a company may not have done that in the past, they can rely on their employee resource groups to say, this is an organization that we feel like we need to give money to, to support, the causes that they are looking to support and they're fighting on behalf of our community. And part of that is under companies' new initiatives, those ESG, environmental safety and governance. I think which is another good thing where companies are looking more like is going to make our employees feel safe in their communities. What are the
Mhm.
policies that are harmful to our employees?
Making people have to work in the office when that's harmful to the people.
Yeah.
That is.
And also, that's a good point. Like for people who work at jobs, like I know my company does the same thing. Amplify the voices and the impact and the reach of solid righteous organizations that you know about. Like I know at my company they will match donations to
Yep.
certain organizations that employees donate to, or like I can get 8 hours a year to go volunteer at an organization and I will get paid, and the organization will also get a donation. So like if you know places that are small that will probably never make it to the radar of a place where you work, make sure you take the names back. Like I know we recently did an episode about land loss, and Kavan and Ashanti from Where Is My Land. Hey y'all, hey. I know I'm so excited to talk their work up to the people at my job that I know write those checks. So if you have that opportunity to maximize the scope of influence of organizations that are out here really trying to do equity work and inclusion work, you might not be able to get it done in a corny workshop, but them dollars, they help. They help.
Yeah, and I think it's important too to interrogate, the giving programs that you have. If you find that your corporate giving program is too restrictive, for you to be able to make donations to some of these groups that are working on these different justice and equity projects, bring that to the attention of the corporate giving department and say, is there some leeway or is there something that maybe we possibly might need to look at changing, so that we would be able to support more communities that are doing this work and that are aligned with our DEI strategy and goals.
So, Deonta, as we wrap things up today, what advice do you have for the brokers out here who, you've been telling us what DEI is, and what advice do you have for people, like Amber just mentioned, one of the things is corporate giving. Are there other can do within their own jobs and their own spaces to advance the DEI work? And for people who aren't fatalists like I am, who are like, this thing ain't never gonna work, let's give people some hope. What can they do?
I'd say, first of all, just, participate, be vocal if you are safe being vocal, first of all. I don't want anyone to lose their job over being vocal. But, if you work for a company that is empowering people to have conversations, be vocal and participate. One of the things that I find most frustrating is, groups that will get together and, complain and have valid concerns, but they don't bring them to anyone's attention. It's kind of like the squeaky wheel gets the oil. So, it's important to, find someone you trust, understand your organization and how things get done, but, make sure that you're bringing and highlighting concerns to the attention of the leadership team.
And Deonta said, do that, but don't lose your job because I'm not paying your bills. Okay. So only do these
I'll
things
help
if
you
you
find a
feel
new
safe
job
doing
though.
it.
Yes.
But she said, I ain't paying nobody's bills. Well, Deonta, thank you for joining us on the show today. It's been a pleasure to have you. Hopefully, when we put this episode all together, it won't be a completely hot mess. Amber's internet issues and all.
Her
But
sound
Amber,
effects ain't worked in 10 years, and I get kicked off of Rihanna's internet for 2 minutes, and the whole show is gone to hell. You see, this is what we talking about. Injustice.
focus, focus, okay? Get the people the
Mm.
homework.
So the first homework is the recurring assignment because clearly y'all ain't doing it. Y'all supposed to go down to the internet, subscribe to Black Power Media, to the YouTube channel. There is a brokish playlist that you can watch, you can save, you can set the alert, the little bell, and it'll ring ding dong every time we on the internet. And so we know because we get the data, the metrics. Y'all ain't done y'all homework. So it's gonna be on here till y'all do it. And then next, we want to get in y'all's business. So tell us some of y'all's DEI stories because everybody got one. Now, remain anonymous if you need to, protect your job. Change some of the details if you need to. But please share because honestly, the ball is not going to move forward if we keep all of this to ourselves. So hopefully, not only will you share some of your horror stories, but you'll also join in sharing some of the things that have worked really well where you work so that we can steal the ideas and take them back to our job and tell them to, do the same thing. So that's the homework.
Thank you, Amber. Thank you again, Deonta, for joining us today. So, brokers, we know that this country has quite a history of performative efforts to make us feel included without sharing the fruits of our own labor. It's frustrating that even if Black people are being asked to advance the cause of DEI without being paid for. But if America has anything, it's the audacity. And if Black people have anything, it's a I wish you would spirit. So our hope is that as we move forward, we will liberally apply the I wish you would ask me to work for free spirit as we seek to leverage our gifts and make sure that they are paying us fairly and citing us appropriately. And y'all, we know it can be hard to turn down opportunities of any kind when we have so little collectively. But where we can, we need to remind ourselves that we live in a capitalist society. And as my mama says, I don't do free. And we look forward to catching up with you on the next episode of Brokish.